Yeah, this is what happens when you come at the end of 2 days. I think I'll be repeating a lot that has already been discussed and said. We've touched upon policy and guidelines throughout all our small group discussions and even in the other work. So, what I'm going to cover is just a little bit of what the situation is in India on biobanking, touching upon the regulatory framework for general biomedical research. And then I'm going to share some findings from studies that I have done engaging with different stakeholders and looking at what those gaps are with policy. And then my recommendations going forward. So in India, biobanking is still in its infancy. And the problem is because we still do not have a clear definition. There is a problem with typology. We don't have a national biobank, and what constitutes a biobank is still not very clear, but it is compounded by the fact that we have no formal registration required. So whether it is an extension of a pathology lab or whether it's an extension of somebody's freezer as the outcome of a clinical trial, there is no formal registration of that repository as of now. In India, medical research is enabled and guided by the Indian Council of Medical Research. The Indian Council of Medical Research has been in the forefront, I would say, keeping up with international guidelines from the 1980s. And in 2006, we had quite a comprehensive set of guidelines. But in that, biobanking was very minimally mentioned under the chapter of human genetics and genomics. In 2017, however, we have an entire chapter, as was mentioned yesterday also. I'd also like to say that some of my work in terms of reviewing the 2006 guidelines did contribute to the 2017 guidelines. So while I say that biobanking is in its infancy, its attractiveness has not missed India. So we have top-level scientists doing molecular genomic research. We look at gene interactions, looking at biomarkers. It's also something that at the national level is looked at as a matter of pride. Saying that, it's not only that they encourage scientists to do this cutting-edge research. As Akin mentioned, there are some gatekeeping functions that the government does. We do have the Health Ministry Screening Committee that comes in between you wanting to work with a collaborator, especially if you want to share data sets and samples. I don't know whether all ethics committees in their functioning insist on getting health screening ministry clearance. Sometimes it takes even up to 6 months or 8 months just to get the paperwork done. Saying that, we also have had publications, even though I've said it's in the infancy, we have had publications looking at the attractiveness of biobanking in developing countries from the level of rare diseases as well as from other areas. So the ethical dilemmas have not been far behind. We have had reviews of looking at issues of personalized medicine and the commercial angles coming into play with pharmaceutical companies looking at how they can enter this market. We've also had other publications, those are mine in particular. We've had issues to do with privacy and biobanking been discussed from a legal perspective. And just want to move on to these 3 studies that I have published. I'm going to share some of the data that threw up the ethical regulatory challenges that are posed for a country like India. something that I've heard even in the previous presentation is that our regulatories are very robust in terms of clinical trials. And that's also because we've had a number of scandals, number of problems that have come to light. So we have a drug controller general of India. We have to have all clinical trials being put onto a registry. We have to follow the Indian GCP guidelines. The ethics committees have to follow the guidance provided in the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So there are teeth behind those guidelines. On the other side, we do have a science and technology focus. Again, here, the matter of the pride in India brings in some of the politics involved, that we are looking at India being, the incredible place with brains and talent. So Make in India, Incredible India promotes awards and grants in the area of biotechnology and promoting this robust bioeconomy. And we are focused again on enabling our researchers. In terms of the ethical guidelines, we have the Indian Council of Medical Research, I was mentioning, the 2017 guidelines, which covers aspects relating to researchers. So here there is some definition of what biological materials are, what you mean by biobanking and data sets, and there's a focus on what storage and quality and safety is about. In terms of aspects to donors, multiple forms of consent, ownership, in terms of the institution, the custodianship. So what I'm actually elaborating here is that there is a lot of information. I like the line that Akin mentioned yesterday, that these are aspirational statements. They are there to be followed, but there is a problem in actualization. So they remain aspirational. In terms of data repositories and data sharing, so there is now a clear review that is needed. Initially, sitting on an ethics committee, I was also a party to decisions about this is retrospective data. There are no real ethical issues. There's no harm that will be done to anybody. So it was almost like blind approval. Very often, researchers didn't even submit protocols for ethical approval. So those things have changed, that they must be approved by ethics committees, that data privacy, data accuracy, security, legal liability are issues to be looked at, especially when it is outsourced or sold. Health data sets, when exploited for commercial purposes, must adhere to open access provisions. And there needs to be measures in place to maintain and protect confidentiality and privacy. I just brought this in. So this is not related with biobanking, but I'd like to say that now we do have patient health charters in place as part of this national accreditation, of hospitals program. And here again, because it is connected with a legal framework, a law, the Clinical Establishments Act, there is again some teeth in protecting patients who become research participants or contributors in this sense to research. I'm going to share with you a few perceptions about biobanking. I agree with the presentation made yesterday from Peru that people in this study were unaware of what biobanking was about. But when probed to ask whether they would be willing to participate or to contribute as biological sample, nearly all people said yes. They saw no harm in it. Anyway, it's waste. It's something that's already out of me, not like a clinical trial where There may be possible harm. This is again the perception that was there. It was all right also to use medical records. There was the altruistic reason of helping others. Consent and confidentiality were not great matters of concern. Interestingly, this was what rung a bell in my mind, is that as this case unfolded, so I used an unfolding case vignette to get my data, and at that stage, when questions were being probed, suddenly there was a reversal of asking questions. Who is going to be using my sample? Where is it going to be going? Why do they want to need it? So it was not these questions for me that were the finding, but the process. That asking that first question didn't really raise those ethical issues, but this process of deliberation, of reflection, was what came up with these ethical questions. Looking at genetic research, again, when we look at informed consent, it's important to understand how much people understand what genetic research is about. Only a few people had familiarity with genetic research. There were benefits that it may help children in the future, it could prevent diseases. There were also expressed concerns. It's interesting to look at concerns. We very often look at them as misconceptions. And we say, people have far-fetched ideas. This was in another world, looking at eugenics and misuse. But people do feel disturbed, especially looking at the political scenario that is prevalent in the country. That, am I going to be a part of possible racial discrimination? Are they going to be doing racial profiling with my sample? So these are all concerns that people raise. So there is a need also to go beyond consent, and they felt they should be informed. There needs to be accountability. Therefore, there needs to be a coming back to the person who has donated the sample. It was interesting to look at a consent, and consent seems to be so varied that these responses were from both ethics committee members as well as researchers who were clinicians as well. And what you can see here are lay members in an ethics committee, as well as the clinician researcher who felt the person's right has to be protected. That was at one end of the spectrum. You have the ethics committee members in general who saw their role as being necessary to protect the researcher, to enable research, and that's where their priority was. While the basic scientist actually felt that all this issue around consent came in the way. There was a time lag, and that it actually didn't promote research, but it hindered research. And they are actually far removed from the actual participant or the donor of the sample. Ownership also was very contentious. It was seen as a gray area. And this is an area that has come out even in our guidelines, where there was a view among people to say that actually the patients are the true owners, and there was a moral construct around that. Ethics committee members said it is the storage facility that has responsibilities, and they are the custodians. Interestingly, there was a connect here to say that if patients are giving their samples and it is an outcome of a health program, then they may want to use the same sample for a secondary investigation or reinvestigation, very often when it is a tumor sample. Researchers, on the other hand, felt that the consent document was what decided ownership. And to me, this was again alarming because it is seen as the consent form handing over ownership to the researcher. And looking at the triangulation of data, the public themselves had no faith in consent forms. They felt consent forms was a way of signing off my right to ask any question, signing off my right to come back and claim ownership.
Angelica, you've got 1 minute.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to move fast now. The incidental findings were also a gray area. There's a case for it and against it. I'm coming down to my recommendations, and this is where I feel our guidelines have to move from having a clinical trial focus where you have the participant who is passive, where you have single standalone studies, and where we have our clear rules and guidelines present. In the area of biobanking, where the focus is on sustained research to be able to sustain subject engagement and look at translation and public utility, we still don't have the guidelines in place. And therefore, ethics committee members need to enable this process of dialogue between society, science, and the regulators to come up with more robust ways of understanding how we can guide our biobanking research and look at empowered participants. This is really what I'm focusing on, where it's a two-way street. It is the principle of collectivism, the principle of consultation, and the principle of stakeholding, all to build trustworthiness. We've spoken about this in our subgroups quite a bit, but to move out of this area of relying on consent as being the focus, but of giving back of those incidental findings, giving back incidental findings as well as research findings, and consultation not limited to education, but listening to those cultural diverse voices, and stakeholding, where we look at governance frameworks for the biobank that has a large say from the general public. In the morning, we spoke about the historical focus on consent. I do think our focus has been on a libertarian framework. We need to move to a communitarian framework where we build the issue of reciprocity and distributive justice and giving back. And this is something that is lacking in our present policy guidelines. And to focus on multiple stakeholders. This is something that the CIOM's 2016 guidelines does. I'm happy that I was there as a commentator, and this is something that they have taken into consideration to give importance to stakeholder voices in good governance. Yeah. Training and capacity is something that we've already spoken about. And I'll end by saying that I don't think we'll be able to end this deliberation here. So I invite all of you to my hometown, to Bangalore, for the World Congress of Bioethics, where I'm sure we can continue to deliberate on these questions that have been raised and where answers may not have been found. So there's more information here. The last day to register for the early bird is actually tomorrow. But you can ask me any questions later about this. So thank you, all of you.